There are 294,000 religious congregations in the United States. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish traditions share a commitment to social justice. They shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, and provide counseling, health care, and daycare to those in need. Working together with elected officials at local, state, and national levels, faith-based individuals are making an impact.
Hello, welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Gretchen Ike. Our topic is Eastern Europe, Religion and Revolution. In the years since 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, he unleashed a chain of events, revolutionary in their significance, aided by his announcement in December of 1988 at the United Nations that 50,000 troops would be pulled back from, Soviet troops pulled back from East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. What followed in 1989 was a veritable whirlwind of change. We are here to look at that whirlwind with some very helpful guests to help us unpack what all that means for the present and for the future. Barbara Green is Associate for Peacemaking with the Presbyterian Church in the USA in the Washington office of the Presbyterian Church. Ed Snyder has been for 35 years the Director of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, also in Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for being here. First of all, let's get a little bit of your own background and why we have invited you to help us understand all the change going on in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Barbara, say a little bit about your own background.
After I finished seminary, I went to work for the National Council of Churches in the U.S. As their liaison to the Federation of Protestant Churches in the German Democratic Republic, GDR, East Germany. So I lived in West Berlin and worked in East Berlin for 5 years between 1977 and 1981. And then I have been back to the GDR every year since then, most years twice a year, and visited most of the other Eastern European countries in the Soviet Union as well.
And have regular telephone contact with all your, all your friends and relations there. Ed, how about you?
Well, I haven't had the extensive experience in Eastern Europe that Barbara has had. I've been working on Capitol Hill most of that time on these kind of issues. But I have had the opportunity 3 different times to visit the Soviet Union, 64, 66, and 86, and to visit in some of the Eastern European countries, and also to visit several of the countries that are related to the Soviet Union in the Third World, in Vietnam and Kampuchea, and Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Let's start with trying to get out the headlines of what all this change, this whirlwind of change, has amounted to. Barbara, what about Eastern Europe?
Well, in the last 5 months of 1989, 6 governments fell. If any one of those 6 had fallen during that time period, we would say what a profound change across Eastern Europe. For all 6 to go, Poland, Hungary, GDR, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, in a 5-month period is really an unprecedented historical shift.
Mm-hmm. What about within the Soviet Union?
Well, of course, the period of perestroika and glasnost has been absolutely crucial, and the increasing freedom of religion and of speech and of opportunity to speak out, to emigrate, all of these things have just created a burst of energy and activity in the Soviet Union in the political area. The biggest job that Gorbachev has been working on is perestroika in a lot of the economic restructuring of institutions, and he's working there against attitudes and ingrained institutions for 70 years or more. Probably in recent days, the most startling events that we've been witnessing have been the advent of a multi-party system, that the Communist Party no longer is claiming sole political authority. And we don't know where this will lead, but this was a key event in some of these other countries in Eastern Europe, which opened up the opportunities for opposition and then for ways for people who did not agree with the communist leadership to vote against them.
So we have political change, we have elections coming, multi-party elections in a number of the 6 countries.
In all 6?
In all 6. Multi-party elections in all 6. Wow. We have economic changes amounting to opening up of trade with the West and changing the internal economic structures.
Although there's a real diversity among the Eastern European countries as to what they're going to do economically, and they really don't know yet. They don't know what their economic future looks like. I think all 6 of them face very serious common economic problems. The Soviet Union too, but let's stay with the Europeans for the moment. First of all, none of them have convertible currencies.
What does that mean?
That means they can't trade their money for any of the internationally recognized kinds of money on the world system. Japanese yen, British pounds, US dollars, the West German marks, the so-called hard currencies. So their money is worthless in terms of participating in world markets. Second, I think the second biggest economic change that they have got to deal with is who's going to own everything, the means of production, the factories, the agricultural fields, the institutions in the cities.
Which had been run by the government.
Which are all now under government ownership and control. And these 2 issues, currency and ownership, are being faced by all 6. I think right now Hungary and Poland are moving toward a more Western market-oriented economy more quickly than any of the others, by their own volition anyway.
What, in your own estimation, is at the root of all this change? What would each of you see as, how do you explain it? Is it a matter of peace through strength and the great military buildup of the Reagan years working?
Well, I think this is something that is going to be debated for a long time, and you can already see people staking out positions, and it seems to be now conventional wisdom that, of course, this happened because the United States had this huge military buildup in the 80s. I think that is a vast oversimplification of a whole complex historical event that we have been seeing, but it goes clear back the nature of revolutions, and when the old leadership dies off and a new generation comes to power, not particularly wedded to some of the doctrinaire policies of the past. And certainly I think we'd have to say that if the Soviet Union and Gorbachev felt that the national security was really could be achieved through spending more for arms, they would have done it. I mean, we saw the tremendous sacrifices they made during the Second World War when they were threatened. Their whole nation was threatened. So that if he had felt that there was any security in arms, I think he would have gone that way. But I think we also witnessed a disillusionment with the whole security through arms, the arms race, and the immense economic burden that was placing on the Soviet Union and on our own country and on other countries around the world. So there are so many things going on here that I think it's really a great mistake to give much credence to this idea that it was simply because of the Reagan military buildup.
Ed, I want to sharpen that. I think the military buildup was irrelevant. I mean, not only an oversimplification, as you put it, but I think it really was irrelevant. That what finally happened was that the system had within itself the seeds of its own demise. Mm-hmm. That it, as Kennan said in 1946 and 47, that left to its own devices, it will eventually collapse. It's just not viable over the long haul. But also would go at the issue in a theological way, if I can wax into that for a moment, and say that I really think that this period of this year is an expression of the theological concept of kairos. There is such a thing as the fullness of time. There is such a thing as ripe time. And the time came. The fullness of time came. The kairos came.
Mm-hmm. Well, and going even farther than that, I'd suggest that that some people argue that, in fact, the Reagan military buildup held back this change in the Soviet Union because it forced them to rally round and try to avoid the inevitable.
To outspend.
To keep up with our spending.
What role has the religious community played in this revolution in Eastern Europe? You worked for 5 years with the churches in the German Democratic Republic. You have good, strong church ties there. What's your view of that?
I think it's a key element. I think for the GDR, the East German situation particularly, several things were crucial toward its coming also to the GDR. One was the preparation of Solidarność in Poland, the 10 years of struggle. One was the coming of Gorbachev on the scene. One was Hungary's commitment to the international covenants of human rights within the total European framework, and Hungary signed the Helsinki Human Rights Covenants and therefore opened its borders. But the fourth thing that was important,
allowing Germans to flow in and out,
was the preparation that the churches had done, and the witnesses of the witness and service and community that the churches had built in the GDR. Ever since, for the GDR particularly, the wall went up in 1961, where they had worked all those years to build their own credible witness, which was a combination of being really the only voice in society that could be critically independent, and also being affirming of people's decision to stay in the GDR and live within the socialist context. So they always said, we can say yes to what's going on in our system when we can, like the commitment to free health care, and we say no when we must, like the limitations on travel. So that this long history of being the voice that had some integrity and some credibility and some moral leadership has really moved the church into a central leadership role in 1989 and 90.
Wasn't it true, Barbara, that the churches, especially in East Germany, were providing a focal place for people before they went out into the streets? They were kind of a rallying point.
Interestingly enough, coming out of the church prayer services and demonstrations against the 1983 NATO decision to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles, after the NATO made that decision anyway, the churches said, we're going to start this long-term commitment for however long it takes to get these missiles out, to have weekly prayer services and vigils. And it was those services which became the mass demonstrations of 1989.
And they were challenging the whole deterrence concept,
oh, yes.
weren't they?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that these these people in the streets throughout Eastern Europe, in a nonviolent way. I mean, I think that we have seen a whole new way in human history. Masses of people in the streets just extracting authority from the government. The government's really helpless. And I think here we'd have to say that it was absolutely crucial that Gorbachev did not order troops to be used.
Yes.
And there is something important there also, that leaders try to find nonviolent ways to respond to nonviolent mass movements. And I'm
going to have to cut you off because we're out of time, but we'll take a quick break and we'll come right back and look at the role of the religious community in the U.S. as well and pick up on this. Thank you. Be right back.
Buckley and O'Neill together, how come?
I'm here to elucidate the prodigious benefits of space technology, and you?
To bring what you say down to Earth. Take this laser, developed for space research.
It may one day supplant the need for coronary bypass surgery.
It could obliterate an artery obstruction in minutes. The patient's up and around the same day.
I'm speechless.
See? The benefits from space are endless.
Space technology.
This is what's in it for you.
Welcome back. We're talking about Eastern Europe, revolution, and religion. And we want to look back with our guest, Ed Snyder, the director of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Barbara Green, associate for peacemaking with the Presbyterian Church in the Washington office. We want to look at the role of the churches in the U.S., the religious community in the U.S., and their active peacemaking, and how that, for the last decade, and how that, you think, has affected the situation in Eastern Europe, all this whirlwind of change we've just been discussing.
Well, I think it's been very relevant. You remember 10 years ago, you said a decade. And when we think back to, that would be the early years of the 80 election and the Reagan administration, the characterizing of the Soviet Union as the evil empire, the sharp divisions, return of the Cold War, the huge increases in the military budget at the expense of many domestic programs. And of course, many churches were having soup kitchens and were trying to help the homeless, and also very deeply disturbed by the possibility that was being discussed of limited nuclear war and of developing all kinds of new missiles and weapons, and focusing especially on Europe. And the churches were actively involved in some of the major demonstrations of the decade, but I think also they built an intellectual and theological underpinning
with the peace pastorals?
With the peace pastorals, the Catholics and the Methodists and other churches all were engaged in this thinking through of the arms race and beginning to challenge the whole concept of deterrence, which has been such a cornerstone of our military and foreign policy.
There also was a lot of visiting back and forth, of trips to the Soviet Union, trips to other socialist bloc countries.
Yes, the National Council of Churches took the lead in some of the exchanges with the churches in the Soviet Union, and people went on personal exchanges and otherwise.
I remember even reading a very important paper on enemy thinking that Barbara Green wrote, helping us to unlock the whole question of, do we need to have enemies?
Yes. I think this was a very important decade. We couldn't have gotten to where we are now without having gone through a lot of that, it seems to me. So when the time came, the churches were ready to support to turn away from arms as a way to peace and to find a new way. And that was cooperation, contacts, working together, exchanges, cooperative projects, and working for all kinds of arms control arrangements, which in the early part of the decade were on the way back burner. But then, well, it's a long story, but the INF treaty that finally did eventuate happened when the Soviet Union, especially Gorbachev, after we had put a position on the table that we thought they would never accept because it was so much to our advantage, and he said, "I'll take it." And this was a part of not feeling that there was security in arms, but there was more security in reducing arms. And then we thought, well, maybe let's test him a little bit more and let's up the ante. And he said, "I'll take that too." And before we knew it, we had a situation where Reagan, the president, could not refuse because everything he'd put out there, they had accepted. And so we got that tremendous landmark treaty and then a whole series of summits, 85, 86, 87, and 88. Between Reagan and Gorbachev, and completely broke everything open. And I think the churches were very supportive of that, but also very helpful in creating a public climate and a climate here in Washington which helped to bring that about.
That without that climate being created by the churches, the evil empire would never have been able to be negotiated with, and the summits held and so forth. Yeah.
I think the idea of enemies and the understandings that we grew into during this period of how we often tend to project a lot of our things outside on some external person, find some kind of a scapegoat. It's a very biblical concept, but these were operating, and we were maturing, I think, in how we looked at the world and of people who were different than we.
One of the things that's happened to local church members, I think, for those of us who come out of traditions, not the historical peace churches, is that across the church, people have discovered vocations of peacemaking, have discovered the relevance of their own work as peacemakers, and developed a real sense of vocation, in the Christian sense, vocation about that. And I think that's going to be real important as we look to what now. And I think for us as church people in this country now, we really are sort of standing at a corner, at a turning point, where we are looking at the world moving away from this bipolar tension, U.S.-Soviet tension, into a more diffuse, multipolar, egalitarian world construction where there are all kinds of ethnic tensions and land claims and religious tensions and some of the more historical tensions able to resurface and maybe even find some more resolution as we look forward. So I think in some ways the work of peacemaking is now just finally getting started, that we can get down to dealing with the conflicts that never could get their own just claim.
What should Eastern Europe look like? Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union down the road of peace. I mean, what's the vision that the religious community brings to that, and what are the practical expectations that you have at this point of what it will look like economically or politically?
My one trip to East Germany since the government toppled in 1989, everybody that I talked to was frantically, just furiously trying to figure that out. There was so much political discussion as I've never heard before, because people were really struggling, really trying to sort of create anew what that might be, and they didn't know either. I think that the so-called Helsinki framework, the Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is the framework that is in place in Europe, which started in 1975, negotiating out some security agreements and some human rights agreements and some trade agreements, where all of Europe participates in kind of an equal footing together with the United States and Canada.
Now, when you say all of Europe, you mean including the Soviet Union?
That's right.
And Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
And the U.S. and Canada,
and
the so-called Helsinki area, the area of the Helsinki Accords, is the framework that has the most promise to find new structures for Europe. I think the future has to be moving away from this bipolar, confrontational, two military blocs and two economic systems that are in confrontation and competition with each other.
So will NATO survive? Should NATO survive?
Well, I think one of the things that's a little bit disturbing now is that people are still in some old habits and patterns of thinking, and there has been a revolution going on. But people are reluctant to give up this security blanket of the armed forces in huge numbers stationed abroad, and of thinking that that's really the place for us to find our security. And I think we need to do some hard thinking about why we need 300,000 troops in Europe, and why, and of course they're already starting to negotiate down, but the levels at which they're talking about are still, I think we have to examine why any U.S. and Soviet troops should be in Central Europe 40 years after the 45 years after the Second World War, and whether and shouldn't we be building up new institutions, economic and political and cultural, that replace that and exemplify the interdependence, which in fact is growing by leaps and bounds now. I think we have to. I think a demilitarized Europe is a way that we ought to begin to think about it. We can keep the name of NATO, but think about it in terms of political and other relations. I tend to think that what Barbara has suggested about the Helsinki framework, which includes all of Europe and doesn't put it in two, well, actually three blocks. One controlled by the United States, one by the Soviet Union, and one the non-aligned countries that aren't in either one. But there needs to be a holistic way of looking at this, and it's a wonderful opportunity for it.
You know, in this country, the debate in 1990 is really NATO or no NATO, and should a new Germany, if it's reunited, be in NATO, and what form should that take, and should the other countries join NATO? And I think it will need to be that NATO hangs around for a while because so many people have so much sense of security at stake in that. But I think the mistake that we're making in talking about it in the U.S., what this policy future should be, is assuming because it needs to be around a while longer, is that therefore it needs to be around forever. And therefore it should be posited as an institution that hangs around in perpetuity. And I wish we could start talking about a gradual step-by-step transition from NATO, even if some of the Warsaw Pact countries join it, to a less militarized institution, from NATO into a Helsinki framework for a single security institution, security framework for Europe. And I think that kind of long-term transition would make the fears and the concerns around German reunification much more manageable than the bipolar situation that we're in now.
Where will the opposition to such new thinking in the U.S. and in Europe and internationally come from? Who would oppose it?
I think a lot of people have a lot of invested in for a long time in thinking that NATO is a good thing, and will therefore kind of out of the inertia of that thinking keep on thinking that NATO is a good thing for a long time. I think also it's hard for Americans to envision U.S. sort of keeping a finger in the pie of Europe outside of a NATO framework, because after all, the European community does not include the United States.
So it's going to require a lot of flexibility on the part of our own government and people this time of incredible opportunity and change. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to have to stop. But it has been very helpful having both of you look with us at this whole question of Eastern Europe, revolution, and religion. Thank you very much, Barbara Green and Ed Snyder. And thank you for watching.